Hello, Robert, and welcome to the podcast. How are you, my friend?
Wonderful. It's great to be here, Avish.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me on this relatively brand new podcast. This on this podcast, my goal is to talk about all things yes and, specifically designed for people who buy into the idea of yes and want to learn how they can bring more of it into their organization, their teams, their work, and even their personal lives. Now, you are not a yes and person. You are a speaker and consultant who specializes in simplified strategic planning. So, before I jump into all these questions I have for you, for people who might be unaware of simplified strategic planning or even the idea of strategic planning in general, I know it's challenging, but could you give us like the 30-second, 1 minute overview of what it is you do for clients and what the benefits are of it?
Sure. So strategic planning is just looking at where you are right now and thinking about where you'd like to go in the future. Choosing a course that is going to take advantage of your capabilities and competencies and hopefully steer you away from direct competition as much as possible. So that's what I do with clients. I sit down, we look at where are we, where do we want to go, and then the third part, which is really critical, is we look at how we're going to get there. So what things we need to do, what things do we need to change to make that work. Usually for business, I work with a lot of nonprofits too.
Yeah, and one of the ways I know you, we've known each other for, gosh, almost 20 years now. Robert is also a speaker, part of the National Speakers Association. And I met Robert through that, and Robert came and did a presentation for my Speakers Association chapter, where you even then applied this to the small business and for speakers, the solo business. So it's really something that can apply large corporations, small business, individuals.
Mhm.
Now, I know you're not a life coach. But But what I see in going over your material and knowing you for years is there is application not just in professional where there's many, but you can apply these same ideas personally even.
Yes. Yeah, and I've actually I've done a little bit of that just voluntarily for my friends. And it absolutely does apply. I think one of the key things people miss in their lives is that if you're not doing the things that you're really great at doing, and you're not really building up some core of competency in your own life, then you're just kind of bobbling along, just trading hours for money, I guess. And that's not nearly as productive for a career. So a lot of my friends, I've really coached them to, drive in directions where they're doing more of what they are great at doing, and sort of building their expertise around that, so that that's who they are and that's what they do.
So I love this idea because I talk about this. So also the other thing about Robert is that Robert has also performed improv comedy. And in fact, we did a show together for a Speaker Association convention, which was a ton of fun. And if you go to my website, I actually have a video clip of a little bit of us doing that up there. I don't even know if you know that. But
I didn't know that, but that's great. I'll have to go check it out.
so, but one of the things I love about improv and creativity is because it's in the moment and because it's fast, it sort of strips away the conscious filters we have. And I've used it as a tool to help people kind of figure out that core, that authenticity, uh, or as you describe it, the core competency. Um, because a lot of times we think about what we should and the limiting beliefs, the little yes but voice in our head. So I was going to talk about this later, but since you brought it up, could you share? You use the term core competency, which might be something that not everyone is familiar with. So when you say core competency, let's start with the business side. What do you mean by core competency?
So I like to use the word strategic competency, because core competencies just leads people into a lot of nonsense, and they're consulting spouting this gibberish all over the place that don't get it right. So a competency is a combination of skills, processes, and knowledge. And for an individual, that's going to be this sort of unique organic combination of those things that you have behind you. So for example, you have a unique combination. I mean, you know, the nerdiness is there, right? The improv, you're brilliant at improv, you're very good at humor. Um, you also have some background in things like IT. And when you weave all that together, sometimes when you're working with certain clients, there's like this brilliant thing that comes up that's amazing, and nobody else in the world can do that. And so when I think about competency, I think about those kinds of things. Strategic competency is when you've got something like that that does two key things for you. It sets you apart from others, and it also creates value for others. So, for example, if it sets you apart from others, I used to use the example, my consulting firm, everybody who works for my consulting firm is a certified scuba diver, and there probably aren't many people in consulting that could say that, and yet it's not valuable for customers at all. Our
Yeah,
clients really don't care.
let me just pause for a second. Is everyone a certified scuba professional diver? Is that a requirement to work for your company, or did that just
No,
happen?
it just happened, and sometimes these things just happen. Sometimes they happen for a reason. Like, I know I've attracted a certain type of person into my organization, and that happened for a reason. Some of it is me, some of it is the kind of people I'm looking for, some of it is, some people might look at my organization and say, eh, that's not for me. And so that is a combination of things. Some of them are intentional filters, and some are unintentional filters.
Okay, gotcha. So it's okay. Sorry, I just want to know about that. Okay, so returning, you're saying that all right, everyone is certified in scuba, but that doesn't provide value. So that's not an actual.
Right.
It's a differentiator, but it's not a strategic competency.
Exactly. So a real strategic competency creates value for customers in a way that's different. So it's not just, I look at myself, it's not just that I know strategic planning. Lots of people know strategic planning. I've done over 2,500 strategic planning meetings. Nobody in the world can say that. And so that's a differentiator. So I always say to people, look, if you want someone who's just done it 100 times, there are probably 1,000 people who can do that. If you want someone who's done it, thousands of times, there you don't have many choices.
Okay, got it. So there's going to be people listening. I'm assuming people who are some of my more regular audiences. They're not necessarily people who own companies.
Right.
They might be people who lead teams. They might be working in HR or accounting. I've done a lot of work with government employees. So, can this same idea of strategic competency be applied to someone who's not at the top of the food chain and can make these broad decisions about like who do we serve and how do we serve it? Can a team leader or an HR person apply the same idea?
Absolutely, because I mean, if you take a department and organization as a most common example, a department does certain things, and they do certain things very well, and they probably do those things better than any other part of the organization. And they should really focus on honing what that is that they do well, and and also delineating why something is something that your department does versus something that maybe another department could do. An example that I used to use was back when I was in banking. I was running IT for this big bank, and the purchasing of computers was something that was kind of in my department. But a lot of computers are not. It's not like you need an IT professional to say, "Hey, run out and buy a notebook or something." So we had another department in the organization that was very good at purchasing because they handled, the mail room and outside contractors and things like that. And for a lot of the purchases we did, that if they weren't like core to the IT world and decision making, I didn't want to touch those. So I said, look, that's not my thing. You do these things really well. You can go out and negotiate a purchase of 500 computers or something, and I don't really want to play that game. I want to play the game of looking at what the core system is, uh, what kind of software we're using, a few things like that that are really going to affect my people.
Hmm.
But that's where I wanted to stay focused. So that's a really good example of me saying, look, I'm good at really the systems architecture side of things. And if you want to build an empire around, purchasing all the office supplies, and oh, by the way, that includes some IT, that's fine. I'm happy to move that out of my department.
So a lot of it's identifying what your unique strength is, and then leading into it. So I have a bit or a lot of the ADD. I think it's safe to say I don't think I'm being insulting by saying you also do.
Very much.
And
Yeah.
and I and I think in the world of overstimulation, social media, constant inundation of stimulus, it's so easy to get distracted. So
Yes.
when you're working with organizations or teams, like I think it sounds great in theory. Just find the thing that you do, what's your strategic competency, and focus on that.
Hmm.
How do you, for yourself and your clients, stay focused on that? Because I've done this. I feel like every month or so, I redefine and rethink about what's the one thing I really should be doing, and then I'm
Right.
really good about focusing on it for a week or two, and then life gets in the way. And the more time I spend focusing on a strategic competency, this little voice and this pressure builds up in my brain that's like, oh, but what about you're not doing these things right now? So how do you stay focused on a strategic competency when life is trying to pull you in 1,000 directions?
Well, and there are two ways to do this that I use a lot. The first is systems. Okay, and the system is I have a way that I say yes to things. And if I say yes to something, I'm fully committed to it. And in that moment, when I say yes to something, I know that the most powerful thing I can do is say no to something. So that's a really important part of the process for me. It's like when I'm talking to someone who might be a client, just whether I even sometimes whether I call them back is about that system of how I determine when I say yes. And that relates to the second thing, which is filters. I use a lot of filters, and the filter is just okay. In some cases, that's not what I do. And sometimes the filter can be a simple thing like in a lot of companies, your price can be a filter, right? If I charge
Mhm.
$10,000 for something, there are a lot of people who aren't going to buy it who might buy the same thing at $100. So that's a filter. But also, if I say this is for you for a certain group of people, that ends up being a sort of inverse filter for the people who are not in that group. If I say this is for people with ADHD, if someone who doesn't have ADHD sees that and say, oh, that's not for me. So filters are really important, and they're important for me internally too. Like I have to filter in what comes into my life.
Right. So taking the time to figure out what those systems and filters are.
Yes,
And
and then
what's interesting,
once you put that in place, then you don't have to change it, and it defends you from the distraction.
about that, and something you've talked about for years, and it was in your book, and I still remember this from the presentation you did for my chapter almost 20 years ago, is you talk about this idea of having an island,
Hmm.
and um, I don't know how hard easy it can be to represent in in podcast form without the visual, but basically, the more narrow your focus, the higher up on the island you are, and the broad, like because an air kind of comes to a peak, and at the bottom is where people are going broad. They say yes to lots of things. They want to serve all the clients or do all the
Yes,
things.
yes.
So and I'm probably butchering it. So could you talk a little bit about, because right now what you're saying is if I focus on this, it makes it easier for me to say no. But a lot of us don't want to say no to things because we feel we're missing opportunities.
Right. So, and you do miss opportunities. That the important thing to remember, as this is especially critical if you have ADHD, is you will always miss opportunities, and you with ADHD, you are always very aware that you are missing opportunities.
Yes.
And so what you have to say is, well, if I'm going to miss opportunities, I want to make sure I miss the opportunities that yeah, I could do it, but I probably shouldn't. I probably should, stay in my lane more or less is a term that a lot of people use. So the concept is that when you're really good at something, if you represent that, the things that you could do spatially, what you find is your effectiveness goes up as you reach the central point where that thing is that you're good at. And so, years ago, I sort of started thinking about this when I was looking at a client that owned a gravel pit, and I learned that there are literally across the entire United States, there is just a series of circles. That there is one gravel pit inside that circle, and there aren't two competitors inside the
Mm.
circle. And the reason is they're selling gravel. It's not, it's not it's not that special. So what is the cost? The cost is getting up out of the ground and shipping it to where it needs to go, right? And
Mm.
so you need gravel if you're making a road or something like that, or making concrete. But you can't do that if you got competitors, because then what do you compete on? It's like, well, we've got better gravel. No, gravel's all the same. So, so you have these circles because outside of a maybe a 10 or 15-mile radius, the cost of the shipping of the gravel becomes the biggest issue. And so if I have a gravel pit here and you've got a gravel pit 15 miles away, the only place we're ever going to compete is where there's a little bit of equality in the cost of moving the gravel to the site, if that makes sense.
Yes. So we're trying
So
to, like, we're almost being like the gravel pit, right? This is our area, and this is all I'm going to focus on. And
right,
if I've got a gravel pit, but I'm like, ooh, I want to expand, and then I start reaching beyond my area, I'm gonna suffer because
right, because
I can't
suddenly it
compete with it.
costs me twice as much to truck the
Right.
gravel over to somebody else's town, and I'm competing with a guy who has much lower costs. So they're always going to be.
Yeah, it's funny. Kind of in one of the things I talk about it is similar. It's like identifying your big yes and. Like, what are the things you really want to say yes and to? What is the core? I talk about it. I use the word core. I don't say core competency, but like, what's at your core? Like, who are you really? And
Mhm.
that's the thing to say yes and to. And my yes and yes but thing is not about never saying no or but. It's about knowing what you want to say yes and to, which then gives you permission to say yes but or no to those other things. Um,
Yes.
but the first step is identifying that strategic competency.
Yeah, and it's a hard one to get at for a lot of people because you can be good at something and that's not necessarily your strategic competency. You
So
know,
what would differentiate it then? Like what's something you're good at versus something that would really be a strategic competency?
I think it's the unique blend that we bring as individuals. Now, if you look at an organization, it's the unique blend an organization brings that they're really good at. It's not just, one of my clients makes packaging, but it's not just the packaging. They're really good at making package that fits seamlessly into the operations of their customers. And that means it's the usability as important as the fancy design because they want to make sure that your machines don't go down. So for an individual, it's sometimes a combination. For example, for me, I've just got this huge range of stuff I'm interested in because I have ADHD. And
Mm-hmm.
so that leads me to say, gosh, if you want me to talk to you for half an hour about, medieval farming practices for something, or, yeah, I mean, something that nobody really cares about, I know it. And what's interesting about that is that the synthesis of that very strange, often obscure knowledge with the activities that I do suddenly allows me to say, hey, this strategic planning situation, this strategic situation of this organization reminds me of what happened to the French during the Hundred Years' War or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And and those connections lead to stories, and stories are always a really good foundation for understanding that people have.
Got it. Okay. Um, so I want to well, before I move off of strategic competency, there's one thing you mentioned which I want to follow up on a little while ago. You said a lot of people, a lot of consultants are talking about core competencies and spouting a lot of gibberish.
Right.
Uh, and I'm just curious, like, if you could explain what you see as like the gibberish around core competencies versus what it actually should be.
So the first piece of gibberish that is the most common is that people think that I go into organizations and say, look, we have 15 core competencies. I say, you don't have 15 strategic competencies. Okay. You have one strategic competency. And that is really hard for people because that one strategic competency idea means that you have to really, really narrow in the focus quite a bit to the
Mm-hmm.
things that you really do well. So I like to use the example of Disney. Like when they started, all they did was, cartoons, short cartoons before Snow White, and today they do hundreds of different things. They have publishing and a cruise line and hotels and clothing, you name it. The competency that got them to each step beyond that grew as they grew as an organization. So they stayed really focused on cartoons, but then they made bigger cartoons, longer cartoons, different cartoons. And then they started to say, well, what about, they did the Disney True Life Adventures, they did nature films. That was a mess for them. They never made a lot of money on it. They did the theme parks. That worked really well. Why did theme parks work and not the documentaries? Well, the theme parks were related to cartoons, right? It was about this fantasy world
Mm-hmm.
that you create. And so at every step they went on, they added something and grew a bigger and bigger competency. And that's what it is. A big organization that does thousands of different things still has one strategic competency. And for Disney today, I'd say that's family entertainment. It's not all entertainment, and it's not family stuff. They don't make car seats for kids, and they don't make that kind of stuff. What they do is family entertainment. And
Yeah.
so you can get big by making your competency bigger and actually having it grow to envelop more and more things. It's like the blob; it sucks things in and it
Right. But you keep
incorporates
that
them. Yeah,
core strategic
exactly.
competency. Okay. Cool. No, I was just the way you had mentioned like there's all this gibberish around it. I was curious
So that
what you meant by
the prime one is we have 15 core competencies. No,
right.
you have one strategic competency. The other item that I think is really rough for a lot of people is the idea that a competency is know-how based. It is not an asset. It is not a person. It is not a location. It is know-how. And a lot of companies resist that. They don't want to treat their know-how as valuable, but it is.
Yeah, and it's kind of brings to the next point. This like the things that we see as valuable, and obviously we're talking about strategic planning and things like that. There's a lot of idea around goals and strategies and tactics, and I think most people who've picked up a business book are familiar with the idea that before you focus on tactics, you got to think about your strategy and you got to think about your goals and objectives, right? Before
Mhm.
you, and a lot of people will jump into action and tactics. And I agree with that model. And here's kind of the idea. And I mentioned sort of vaguely that I want to swing this idea past you. I've kind of been thinking about this, and the new material I've developed is I think the goals before strategy, strategy before tactics model is incomplete.
Mhm.
Because to me, there's two steps that come before the setting the goal or acting on the goal, and that is mindset comes first.
Mhm.
That then leads to emotion and feeling,
Mhm.
and then you go to goals. Because if you've got the wrong mindset, it leads to this kind of negative, unuseful emotion, which then leads to either less empowered goals, less impressive goals, less innovative goals. It leads to mundane strategies and at least inefficient tactics. And I think that so I work a little bit more with small groups and individuals. I think a lot of people struggle because everyone jumps into the goal setting. Like, here's what we want to achieve. And then strategy around it, then tactics. But they never stop to say, what is our mindset? When I think of this goal, what is the mindset I'm bringing to this?
Mhm.
And what is the feeling I have? And so then they spin their wheels and then they wonder why their people are resisting or they're wondering why they can't get themselves to take action. And if we step back and look at this foundational piece that, in my opinion, comes before the goal, strategy, and tactics, once you adjust the mindset and feeling, all that stuff, it basically smooths the road to those things happening. Um,
Yeah.
and so I'm curious because you've obviously done 2,500 sessions of these, and I'm just curious what your kind of thoughts are on that sort of idea and model.
What's interesting to me about that is that it makes a lot of sense. There are really three areas where you have to look at mindset. First is, what is my individual mindset?
Mm-hmm.
If you're calling the shots for a department, you're calling the shots for a business, you're just calling the shots for yourself. Your individual mindset is a really important tool that you bring to the table. And being aware of that and thinking about it beforehand will lead you in different directions. So I think the idea that you can have a boring mindset or an interesting mindset is an interesting one. Psychologists talk about sort of an open mindset or a closed mindset, right?
Yep.
So open mindset is seeking new knowledge, learning from people, incorporating new ideas. Closed mindset is you already understand everything, and you see both of those in
Yeah. And
individuals, right?
it's almost like you could describe those two as a yes and mindset and a yes but mindset.
Yes, yes, exactly. Exactly. One is a yes and mindset. And that's true for teams of people, that a team can culturally adopt a
Mm-hmm.
mindset that is a yes and mindset. It's open, it's collaborative, it's flexible, or there can be a closed mindset. And you see this in different organizations. A lot of banks tend to have very closed mindsets because they worry that people are going to steal their money because they
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of it. A lot of people in creative worlds tend to have a more open mindset about some things, but sometimes it's a little too open, and they say yes and to everything, and they don't have those filters
Yeah.
that help
So there's
center them.
balance.
Right, right. So there's a balance. And then there is for the whole organization, not just for a team, but for the whole organization, you can have a mindset. You can adopt a culture for the organization, just like you can for a team or for yourself, where you think in an open way or you think in a closed way. And it's a choice. Sometimes that happens by default and not intentionally. Some people don't
Yes.
choose those mindsets.
Well, I think that almost no one does.
Yeah.
And certainly organizationally, I feel it's goal, right? And sometimes it's oftentimes a top down goal, right? The executive or the new CEO comes in with their new vision, or a new manager's like, here's what we're gonna do. Um, and I agree. Obviously, we can achieve goals without addressing mindset and emotion, but I think it happens in one of two ways. Either it's like you said, by happenstance, right? You happen to have the team already with the right mindset, or the goal happens to be one that gets people positive, so it's
Mm-hmm.
by chance. The other is, I do think, as in many areas, you can short-term brute force it. um, if it's a goal that needs to be achieved in short term, you can say it doesn't matter if you got a yes but mindset and people are negative. You can kind of force people to do something for a short period of time. But if we're talking about long term retention, morale, productivity, engagement, you know, that's where you see these organizations end up. Maybe they get immediate short term benefits, but then it tapers off because there's only so long you can. The the beatings will continue until morale improves type management style.
Yes. Yes. And sadly, there are a lot of people who think that that's how you manage people. That's how you supervise people, which is terrible leadership.
Yeah, and it's funny. I was at a conference and a speaker before me, not surprisingly, an older gentleman, started talking. It was very motivational. He was a great speaker, but he said the whole section about feelings. Like, why did feelings become so important? Like, when did feelings? There's this whole thing about people saying feelings don't matter, feelings shouldn't matter. I don't care how you feel. And what's interesting to me is, you ever notice that people who say that are generally in highly emotive states? Like, they're like, I don't care how you feel. Feelings shouldn't
they're,
matter. Like,
they're
sir, your feelings are
angry.
very high.
They're angry because for those people, anger is the only valid feeling.
Yes. And what they're really saying is not feelings don't matter. It's that I don't want to deal with your feelings. It's like, um, but the people who say feelings don't matter forget one very important thing, is that we are human beings and
Yeah.
we're just emotional creatures. And so I feel like and the number I don't know. It's interesting. I know you generally work with the top level, so maybe you don't see this as much. But the times when I'll go in and do a training or work with a group, it's amazing how the manager will call you in and they'll outline, here's kind of the issues, here's what you want to work on, and then when you get in and talk with the group, the the issues from the group's perspective is all the demeanor and leadership style of the management. It's like, oh, we
Yeah.
want our team to communicate more effectively and take more initiative. And you get to talk to those people, it's like, oh, yeah, it's because every time we do, they yes but us, or they don't listen to what we say. It's like, oh, okay. Like, you got to work on the mindset for yourself and your people if you want them to adopt the change. That's why so many people resist change, is because we're just trying to use it straight from a logical standpoint. Like, oh, here's why you should do. I don't know, this is my soapbox. I could go on, but I'm here to I'm here to talk when
No,
I can hear you.
that's
So
great. Yeah, that's fabulous. I think that's a really good way of, in a nutshell, talking about the cultural issues so many organizations face. Because if it's just top down, then you're always telling people how to do their job, and that's always a mistake. You never tell people how to do their job. You give them an objective and let them figure out how to do their job. But if it's all bottom up, then people are just, you got people at the bottom of the organization just wandering around saying, look, let's just do it my way. And you've got, 1,000 people doing it their way, which can work, but it's like herding cats in a lot of situations.
yeah, and I find it for leaders, and you talk about this in your book, which I like a lot, is that it's not about, like, I talk about the yes and mindset, which is not about doing what everyone says and giving in and being a pushover, but it's about engaging them, asking questions and listening. Now you as the leader then have to synthesize that information and come up with the best plan, and sometimes that plan will not accommodate what everyone wanted. But I feel like if a employee feels like they were able to contribute, they were respected, and they were listened to, that even if you don't do what they wanted you to, they will like feel differently. They'll feel more positive about the direction you chose because you actually listened to them.
Yes, and that's a rule I use in strategic planning. That when we go into the room to do strategic planning, everyone understands that you're not going to get everything you want, but when we come out of the room, we're going to have our plan. It's going to be our plan, and you're a part of that, us. So we came up with this, and you're going to be listened to. You're going to be heard. We're gonna bring your perspective into the process, but it is not the only perspective that we have to look at. We have to balance a lot of different issues.
Yeah, and I love that approach of we versus you or we versus me. It's like it's ours. It's not made yours. That's a nice way of setting it up, because I feel like when the leader comes in, it becomes about me. Or sometimes, and you probably have to encounter this, right? Sometimes in a team or a workshop, a facilitation like you're doing, you get that sort of alpha personality who tries to drive everything. Every time you have a question, they're the ones who want their. And if it's been a long time, everyone else might be so beat down by that person that they don't even bother speaking up after that alpha has spoken, because it's like, oh, whatever, Bob is going to get his way. What's the point? So, do you encounter that, and do you have ways of dealing with that, like dominating personality?
Absolutely. It is one of the challenging personalities that I deal with. There are a lot of different ones, but that's a really common one in entrepreneurs and CEOs
Mm-hmm.
that, they come into the room saying, it's going to be my way or the highway. And I just have to sort of make sure that the processes don't allow for that. So, for example, in a lot of processes where we might just let someone talk and listen to them talk for 10 minutes, which always ends up being that alpha personality. What I'll tend to do is saying, look, we're going to have to come up with about 30 different things here. And so what I want you to do is think about the things from your perspective. Then we're going to go around the room and each person's going to give a thing until you run out of ideas. And so we'll get those 30 ideas, but each person on the team has brought up their ideas. And that alpha personality is only one person on that team. So they don't come up with 90% of the ideas. They come up with, 10 or 5% of the ideas, depending on the size of the team.
And this kind of goes back to what you said earlier in a slightly different way about having systems and filters. Like you
Yes.
said, you have them for yourself, but if you've got this person having a process or a system to deal with it in advance, I think a lot of us, and I'm guilty of this as well, you just sort of hope they won't be a problem today, even though there's never been a time where they haven't. But you're like, oh, maybe today he won't speak up like that. But having a system in place, like, all right, we're gonna have a system where each person only gets this amount of time, so everyone has to contribute. Like, and I think once you have like, there's something weird about putting something down in writing or having a system. Everyone sort of goes along with it, versus just trying to say, okay, Bob, why don't you like let someone else speak? It's like
Right.
it becomes
If
more
I give
combative
someone
that way.
rules, then they have to obey the rules.
Yeah,
And since I'm defining the process, I can make up rules. And so, over the years, I've made up different rules, and I found that rule of going around the table and letting each person put one idea in until you run out of ideas helps to balance it. Otherwise, you get the guys from sales are talking a lot, or the CEO is
yeah,
talking a lot, and the guy from IT or the guy from accounting isn't saying much, but they know some really important stuff that we have to pay attention to.
yeah. And two quick strategies I've used in this in various environments. One is sometimes when I present to a speaker's chapter on some topic, you want to do quick introductions to get a sense. But speakers, if you give them the introduction, so I'll literally set a timer
Yeah.
on my phone. I'll be like, all right, you got 30 seconds, and I got a bell because I use it for my presentations, and I'll just ring the bell. And so having a fixed time helps. Um, and the other thing, to that point, like the IT guy or the accounting woman or whoever who's not speaking up as much but has great ideas, I will sometimes start a brainstorming ideation quote unquote session with 5 minutes of individual writing. Like
Oh.
you just write on your own.
Hmm.
Um, and then you share what you came up with, because now the extroverts would hate this because they just want to speak and get it out, but the introverts love it because they get to generate their ideas and then look them over, and then they can pick ideas off their sheet to share. It's a way of tapping that genius of the people who maybe won't speak up, uh,
Yes.
which I
That's it.
encourage people to do. The free writing thing I think is incredibly powerful, but
Yeah.
that's a whole whole other
Yeah,
thing.
I like to frame the free writing for people. I like to tell them, write something down. I want you to have at least 5 bullet points, and I want the bullet points to be 1 or 2 words each. And the reason
Yeah.
I do that is if I do free writing, there will be one guy who does War and Peace, and he wants to read the whole thing out loud to
Yes.
the group,
Yes.
and they're
Well,
sitting
then the
there
timer comes
going,
into play as well. Well, this brings something else you mentioned years ago, which and I've quoted this at times in various presentations I do, is for brainstorming sessions, you will go in sometimes and say, "What's the stupidest thing we can do?"
yes,
So
absolutely.
talk more about that and about like what do you mean by that and why do you do that and how does that work?
So if I ask for what are the good ideas in any organization, everybody thinks about this all the time. So they're going to come up with the same good ideas. And it's not that they're terrible ideas, it's that they're the same ideas that your competitors are thinking of. So if
Mm-hmm.
I ask what are the stupid ideas, what I find is the best ideas, the most unique and most creative ideas are often hiding behind the stupid ideas. And
Yes.
we don't think those ideas partly because we go there and a part of our brain says, "Oh no, we can't do that. That's not right because none of our competitors do that." But if I ask you to come up with the stupid ideas first, what ends up happening is there is a reason why the idea is stupid, and examining that reason in some cases, and it's not most of the case, most of the cases it's stupid for a reason, but in some cases, understanding why the idea is stupid can help us to take a jump ahead of our competition by doing something they would never consider because it's connected to a stupid idea.
Yeah, I love this, and I kind of talk about something similar with the free writing. Like you write down the stupid. I've literally said almost the same thing. Sometimes the best ideas are hiding behind the worst ones. So let's shift that then to a little bit on the personal level. Let's say you've got a person who's got some goal in their life. They want to lose some weight. They want to write that novel they've always been thinking
Mm-hmm.
about doing. They want to develop their own board game or video game, and none of these goals are personal to me, by the way. Uh, let's just say I'm not looking for free coaching right now. No, but let's just say you've got, it's one thing for a business to say, all right, what's the stupidest thing we can do? We got this product. All right, here are the dumb marketing ideas. But for an individual who maybe wants to bring a little more yes and creativity to their life, how could they use this idea?
So the idea of looking at the stupidest thing, one of the things I like to challenge people to do, um, and I usually do this before I ask for the stupidest thing. To me, that's the last straw. If I find I can't get a rise out of a team, then I ask what's the stupidest idea, because they're
Okay.
you okay. And the reason is that they they feel they need permission to come up with some weird stuff. But I'll start by saying, let's come up with some weird stuff first.
Yeah.
And so if I say to you, well, okay, Avish, what is the weirdest thing you can do? If you want to do a novel and a game and you also want to do some coaching and consulting, it's like, what's the weirdest thing you could do? And say, well, why don't I do all 4 of those things at once? And that's probably dumb for a lot of reasons, but there probably are like 2 or 3 of those you could do at once that would actually be a little weird, but kind of cool. And probably also
Yeah.
really well connected to your unique talents because you have talents in all those areas. And if you could have a way to sort of set the hooks in so you pull them all together for 3 of those ideas, maybe not all of them. Maybe you don't do a video game and a board game and consulting and so on. But maybe you do. Maybe you write a book about it and you can do consulting about whatever you write a book about. And the
Well,
question
what's
is,
really funny about that is I didn't do this process, but I just finished a first draft of a novel finally after 40 years.
oh, wow.
Um, the premise, though, and you'll love this, and I might be revealing this too soon to the public here, but the 7 people that might be listening to my brand new podcast. And actually, I was going to talk about this with you after we were off recording, but hey, why not do it here? I'm going to look for beta readers when draft one, when I got a lot more work to do. The premise, though, is it's a superhero story.
Mm-hmm.
The main character is a consultant who's hired by a supervillain to learn how to make his systems process more efficient so he can be more effective in achieving his evil goals. So that combines my experience as a speaker and in business with my
Yeah.
nerdy love. And then had I gotten a walking desk, a standing desk with a walking treadmill pad, right? You could have combined the fitness goal with the writing and the business goal. And my mind's always working. I'm like, how could this become a game as well? So it's funny you throw this random idea out there, but it is amazingly true how. And what I find, and tell me if this there's this whole thing. I have this thing about SMART goals. Um, Great SMART goals, obviously tried and true project management, but I think SMART goals are also limited because what I talk about is I think most of our goals should be SMART goals. I think one of our aspirational goals should not be. And what I mean by that is that the strength of a SMART goal is that you don't have to think, right?
Mhm.
You come with your goal, you make your plan, you get your checklist, check, 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 you achieve the goal. The problem is the strength of that though is the weakness. And because we don't have to think for a SMART goal, that means we don't have to engage our creativity.
Mhm.
And what I find is what increases engagement on a personal level is creativity. The more I'm using my creativity, the more engaged I feel. So when I'm trying to achieve a SMART goal, it doesn't access that part of my brain. When I set a goal, and I talk about setting a goal you don't know how to achieve or
Mm.
something weird, because
Mhm.
what then you have to do is you have to engage your creativity. And it is amazing how, if it's a goal that matters to you, right? Not just a goal like you feel you should do or, oh, this would be good for our business if we achieve this impossible goal. But something like, wow, I would love to do that, but I have no idea how.
Mhm.
Now you're engaged in your creativity. Well, how could I do that? And now you got to think about what's the stupidest way, what's the weird thing I could do. And so for like 99% of your goals, make them smart because you want to achieve those. But if you're feeling like you want to go for something bigger, setting a goal you don't know how to achieve, and then engaging this creative process, like even just now speaking to you about the book and the treadmill, like I started to feel excited.
Mhm.
And I already wrote the book, so it's not even like a goal I'm going to do. But it's like,
Well, yeah, there are a couple things that makes me think of. First, I think the creative piece that a lot of people struggle with in using SMART goals, and so SMART is an acronym for specific, measurable, achievable result that is time related. I think the one that people struggle with the most is the result.
mm-hmm,
When you ask people to set a goal, they will often come up with an action. So, for example, when I wrote my first book, I started out thinking I want to write a book, okay, but that wasn't the result I was looking for. Like
mm-hmm,
there are hundreds of people, thousands probably, who've written books that are just sitting on a shelf somewhere and nobody's ever going to publish it. But obviously, I wanted a book that was published, so I had to say that that was the result. But then I had to say, well, why do I want to write a book? And I had to
mm-hmm.
get creative about, okay, my market, a really successful book in my market is going to sell like 50,000 copies because I'm doing management books. It's not like
Yeah,
writing, Harry Potter or something like that.
right. You're a
Um,
little bit behind JK on that one.
yeah, yeah, I'm doing really well if I hit 50,000. So when I wrote my first book, I sat down and said, well, what do I want that book to do for me? It's not just that I want to write a book because somebody said they'd pay me a higher speaking fee if I wrote a book, although that
Yeah.
is true. It's also that I wanted to
Welcome to
accomplish.
Avisha's first book.
Yeah. And the second thing that's interesting is that is a really good example of something I had no idea how to do. When I wrote my first book and I
Mm-hmm.
said, okay, the real objective is to get a book published and sell 50,000 copies and have it, build my credibility with a certain group of people. I didn't know how to do that. And so what I find is I write action plans for the objectives that I set for myself every year.
Yeah.
And the action plan for that was much longer and it took much more research to write it than the sort of, oh yeah, I can just do this, I can just
Right.
knock that out, right? So those are the really strategic action plans. Those are the strategic objectives, the ones you don't know how to do because you're going to learn something that you bring into that competency we talked about earlier.
Yes.
So
Yeah, and I think that's the
that's
other thing is
really
like you get
important. Yeah,
creative, but you have to learn and grow and improve,
exactly.
which also creates a level of engagement. There's like the Gallup poll surveys, right? When you talk about what are employees looking for, and opportunities for career growth and personal development are often, or professional development are often higher than compensation,
Yeah.
because it's just something that people crave. Is like So we can bring that to ourselves, set a goal you don't know how to achieve, but then learn and grow and use your creativity. So I encourage people to do that all the time. Like pick something that stretches you that you'd be excited to do, and then make that a task to go figure out.
Yeah. And that's, it's one of the things when I hired people, I always I always sat down with them and said, like, what do you want to learn? How do you want to grow in this job? Because I don't just want to hire you and have you be a consultant for 10 or 20 years and then retire. And some did that, and
Sure.
they that's what they want to do. That's fine. But there were some of them that went on and got jobs at CEOs at much larger companies, or they moved into private equity. I had one assistant who started a web design firm. I mean, it's always there's always should be a next step, and that next step may be outside of your organization, which is fine.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of the how you grow leaders, right? Like
Mm.
you don't get the great people that you keep forever. Like your job as a leader should be to grow leaders, which means they will inevitably leave you.
Right.
Which people don't like change, so it's not for a lot of people. It's not an appealing goal, but for the best leaders, that's kind of what they're striving to do.
If you keep people forever, it may be because they don't have the ambition to move out, or they don't have the courage to go do the next step in their
Yeah.
lives. It may be that you're overpaying them.
Oh, that's a good point too. Yeah,
I
that's
mean, there are a lot of reasons why people stay forever. It might be you're overpaying them, and they look around and say, "Look, nobody else is going to pay me $200,000 a year to do this." And
it's a good point.
it
I didn't think
it
about
may
that.
be that you're giving them too nice a job. Hey, nobody else is going to pay me to sit around the pool at a hotel. There are a lot of different reasons why people don't leave.
All right. Well, that's great, and we're coming to the end of our time here.
Oh, darn.
I know this is great. You've given me a lot to think about and stuff that I feel like I got to go and throw out my do a new strategic plan for myself. Really, um, which it is. You start out. The one thing I didn't ask you about, and we're talking about individuals and like, oh, Robert does like multi-day, year-long engagements. What does that have to do with me if I'm just a team leader or myself? But the whole thing is that your book and your business is all about simplified strategic planning. Um, and you mentioned in the early, it's like simplified doesn't mean simplistic. Um, but your goal is not to overcomplicate the process, right?
Right. I mean, consultants as a rule tend to bring in a lot of jargon and complicate things. And I wanted to move in exactly the opposite direction. I want people to understand what I'm doing. I want them to feel connected to the process. And I don't want them to get all caught up in, what's the difference between a core competency and a strategic competency? Well, who cares?
Yeah.
How does
Well,
it
I do on
work?
this podcast, damn it. Well, what I love about it is that you simplify it. Like you got a whole book, and you go into depth into things that you need to do, and there's a lot. But really, you start out. It's really just answering three questions, right? It's what do we sell? Who's our customer? And how are we going to beat or avoid the competition?
Exactly. That's all you
Like
need to know.
it's three questions. Now, the process and the journey to answer those questions is why your process might take a week, or multi days, or um, because they're not necessarily the easiest questions to answer, but they're very simple. It's like just answer it. And you lay in the book, it's great. You lay out like a whole process, how you can do it yourself, how leaders can take their own teams through it. So, I mean, I think that's one thing that I think a lot of people find comfort in complexity. It's like, oh, in that, like, oh, here's my like 20-step process, and then versus just like two or three real simple things, it seems almost too simple. But it's like, well, if you take the time to answer these three questions, business will get much easier for you.
Right. Complexity is the smoke and mirrors that a lot of people use to hide the fact that they're idiots. So,
Yes, I do. Like I made a highlight here and on page 29 of your book. You wrote, "Thinking is a very underrated skill."
did I really write that?
Yeah, you did. It's right there in your book, page 29.
That's hilarious.
But it's true, right? We don't want to think, and we don't do the deep
No.
work, and it's great. All right. Well, before we finish off, I have one question for you that I didn't tell you in advance. And then I want to end with, So one of my premises is like small but impactful changes. So I think the world would be a better place if everyone started with the default mindset of yes and instead of yes but.
Hmm.
You don't have to say yes and everything, but if your default was yes and, I think everyone would be nicer to each other. We'd be more understanding, more compassionate, more empathetic. So for you, what is or is there what one small thing do you believe if people just started doing differently, it would make the world a better place?
I you're familiar with the butterfly effect, right?
Yes.
Like if you step out a
Butterfly flaps
butterfly.
its wings in Tokyo and it changes the weather
Right,
in
right.
Colorado.
Okay. So the thing that is exciting about that to me is that that is very true, but it is also true that the little things that you do today are going to have those kind of expanding effects in the future. So the thing I always like to ask people to think about is what what minor changes can I make in my life or in my organization that might be just small changes in processes or filters, but will have a growing and expanding effect on the world around me that will change things. So that's the one thing that I love
Mm-hmm.
working on is
Just focus on that small little change you can make.
what's that one easy simple change, and it may be that it's easy for me and it's hard for everybody else, and that's fine.
Yeah,
That's
and that's
I
I
mean
think the
that's
things
the
that we overlook, right? We take for granted the stuff that's easy for us, whereas to other people they might think it's amazing. We're like, ah, it's not a big deal, so we really downplay it. But that's the stuff I think that's that strategic competency almost, right? It's
yes,
easy
yes.
for me.
And that really the core element there is valuing yourself, right? Valuing the things that are easy for you as being valuable because you're unique and really capable, and you do make choices every day that can have this growing and expanding effect on the world.
Well, it's funny as a fellow sci-fi fantasy type nerd, you'll appreciate it. It was a meme I saw, and I don't know if it's attributed to anybody, but its basic premise is that in science fiction, the protagonist is always we're always cautioned, we're always worried about if I travel back in the past, you don't want to change anything because the smallest change you make in the past could have massive impacts on the present,
Hmm.
right? And we all believe that. But we never think about, well, that also means that the smallest actions I take right now could have massive
Exactly.
impact in our future.
Exactly.
So we accept it for science fiction, but in our lives, like, oh yeah, no, that little small thing you do right now could have a huge effect down the road.
Right.
Uh, well, thank you, Robert. This was fantastic. I learned a lot. I had a great time chatting with you. For people who may want to check you out, read your book, maybe even engage your services for strategic planning because it can have a huge impact on an organization or a team. What's the best way to contact you or learn more about you?
Well, my website is cssp.com, Center for Simplified Strategic Planning.com, and that's a great way to reach me. And if you want to email me, you can always email me at rbradford@cssp.com. And I get emails all the time. I love to answer questions people have, and I love solving problems. So if anyone has a puzzle in their work or in their business that they and you love that too, I know
I
you do.
I do.
If anyone has a problem, that's where I really shine. I think clients always ask me, "Do you think you're worth the money?" I said, "Well, did I solve any problems?" I said, "Yeah, then I'm worth the money."
I love it. All right,
I
so
don't want to
that's
solve $2 problems. I want to solve $2 million problems.
well, yeah. So if you, I mean, whether you've got a $2 million problem, reach out. Robert, can help you. Preferably the $2 million problems, but $2 problems always open the doors to things.
Yeah.
So again, cssp.com.
Yes.
Thank you everyone for listening. I'll put some of this information also in the show notes for this thing. So Robert, thank you very much for your time, and yeah, I'm definitely gonna invite you back on again so we can talk more about some of this stuff.
Awesome. Thanks, Avish.